our, there we go. So welcome to our second of two workshops focused on building resilience on Cape Ann. So this effort is being led by Town Green, a local grassroots organization on Cape Ann, and it's represented by Greg Federspiel, Valerie Nelson, and Dick Prouty. They received technical assistance from EPA for these workshops, who is also represented on our team by Genevieve Dabrowski, Abby Hall, and Cheryl Rosner. Myself and my colleague Ellie Baker are with Horsley Witten Group, and as I mentioned, we are a contractor with EPA. So Town Green received assistance from EPA's Building Blocks for Regional Resilience for this effort. And I'd like to give the floor to Genevieve Dabrowski just to give us a brief overview of that program.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. So as Chris mentioned, I'm from the EPA's Office of Community Revitalization, and we offer a variety of technical assistance programs to help communities around the country come together to bring broad groups of stakeholders together to do what we're doing today. So we spent our first workshop talking about what are the priorities for the Cape Ann region, and this workshop will be going through our next step, which is to decide what to do about it, basically. And we use the 5 steps in the Regional Resilience Toolkit, which I can link to in the chat if anyone's interested in reading it. Completely open document that any community can use just to kind of help guide their regional resilience planning. So, you know, we always say there's things to do on every single level when it comes to planning for future resilience work. So, you know, there's local, there's national, there's everything in the middle, and regional is the scale that we're targeting with these workshops. So that's it. Unless there's any questions, I'll pass it back to you, Krista.
Thank you, Genevieve. And as she touched on, so through this effort, the team is looking at new approaches to build resilience against climate change and severe storms, including thinking about collaboration between communities on Cape Ann, really to address common threats and reach common goals. So this includes identifying projects and efforts that either individual communities can do, but also really actions that could benefit from a collaboration or partnership among the different municipalities. We'll also be helping to identify potential funding sources for those projects identified. There are some parallel projects or efforts going on that we hope to incorporate into this discussion, and you'll be hearing about those as well this morning. And so, you know, in order to kind of get these ideas and these projects, we are supporting 2 workshops. So this is the second. The first was held on April 27th. And as Genevieve mentioned, we talked about who and what is vulnerable to impacts on Cape Ann, and I will give an overview of that shortly, what we heard. And today we're going to be thinking about how to address those vulnerabilities and to really start to prioritize regional partnerships and projects. So our agenda today. So first I'm going to touch on what we heard on our first workshop. We're going to hear from our parallel projects that are happening. So the typologies of vulnerability being led by Harvard, Voices for Climate Action also being led by Harvard, and some local interviews that are happening related to climate. We'll get into small groups and really start thinking about ideas and actions on how to move forward. And then we'll have a report out on sort of a larger group discussions talking about priorities, capacity, information needs needed to go forward. So this conversation can continue after today. So our first workshop, so during that, participants talked about sort of the economic, social, environmental aspects of Cape Ann communities that were most at risk for severe storms and climate change impacts. So what we heard was what's most at risk. So really important infrastructure was highlighted, Gloucester's wastewater treatment plant, the Manchester water treatment plant, drinking water reserves, the power grid, roads and bridges, those specifically mentioned Grant Circle, Thatcher Road, and Cut Bridge. Obviously the hospital because of its location and access to it. Natural systems were also highlighted as being at risk because some of the hard infrastructure like a seawall can reduce the ability of dunes and marshes to provide that buffer against storms. Who's at risk? Many talked about Cape Ann's more vulnerable residents, our older residents, young people, people without insurance, those with mental health conditions. And while we specifically heard about downtown Rockport businesses being at risk, there are obviously, others that are also at risk. And then finally, as well as residents who have not historically been engaged in this process are also sort of at risk. And some of the things that we heard about the challenges associated with climate change and what severe storms present, really, the mental health impacts related to stress and uncertainty around these future events, planning for the elderly during emergency situations. A big one that people talked about was public education, really to motivate people to prepare versus responding to a crisis, engaging climate deniers and really unmotivated residents. One of the other challenges, people who are most vulnerable are really difficult to reach, and that is a big barrier to overcome. And thinking about capacity to return to normal or rebuild as is, and thinking about financial capacity, land, or the natural environment capacity to respond and return to normal. They also provided some ideas for us to think about today, ways that communities can work together, connecting with neighborhood coalitions and networks. Again, public education on emergency preparedness came out, creative messaging and visualizations to help inform people, and then really focusing on topics that will resonate with residents. So today we have two major outcomes that we would like to walk away with. The first is a list of priority projects and ideas that the Cape Ann communities can move together to address the vulnerable people, places, and infrastructure. Second, we want to identify information that will help make decisions around resilience planning for residents, for local leaders. I also would like to just emphasize, we do recognize that it is a smaller group compared to the larger Cape Ann region, but we are looking for a starting point to start thinking about collaboration and partnerships among the communities for future conversations. And with that, I would like to introduce Professor Charles Waldheim from the Office of Urbanization at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design.
Thanks so much, Krista.
You're welcome.
And thanks to you and your team at Horsley Witten. Of course, thanks to everyone at the EPA for all of your support. We're very pleased to be invited to join you this morning. And thanks also, of course, to all of our colleagues at Town Green across Cape Ann and the core group and the Cape Ann Climate Coalition that they approached us a little over 2 years ago, just before the pandemic hit in the spring of 2020. We are a school of design architects, landscape architects, urban designers, planners. We're concerned with the built environment broadly. And our research group, the Office for Urbanization, we work with communities across the US and across the world, focusing on the decision-making process and how they might think about their futures. We've done quite a lot of work in the climate change or climate adaptation space. As Krista mentioned, at the first of these workshops, my colleague Kira Klingen presented the beginnings of a project, and I wanted to share a little bit of an update to that now over the course of the next couple of minutes. So Krista, Kira, can you see that screen? Does that look right to you?
You're good.
Excellent. So briefly, we've been working over the course of a year-long project focusing on trying to come to terms with and understand the levels of threat, the levels of vulnerability across Cape Ann. This began with what we call a scenario zero. This is what Kira Kleen presented last time. A scenario zero for us is assuming a steady state. If we do nothing, assuming we don't prepare, we don't respond to any of the changing climate, as the seas rise, increasing intensity and number of storm events, we use that as an opportunity to model a kind of middle of the road hurricane that comes up through in 2038. And we're using this not because we wish any ill will on Cape Ann and our friends there. Of course, we don't want a storm to hit, but in a kind of scenario planning, we're modeling a likely outcome, something that seems plausible. And we're using this as a kind of stress test. we're kind of using this like a test, maybe like you go to the cardiologist and you kind of get on the treadmill, and they don't want you to have a cardiac event, but they do want to push you a little bit and see what's the baseline. This morning, I wanted to present briefly our ongoing work under what we call Scenario 1, which is a very high-level overview of various proposals to respond to that threat, as Krista mentioned. Over the course of the next several months, we'll be continuing 2 other studies. One is building net zero housing, because obviously housing is one of the keys on Cape Ann, and looking at recovering waste, given the focus on wastewater and water treatment. We think of this work as a form of scenario planning. Scenario planning is a process that's been endorsed by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it is really the complement to more statistical or probabilistic models of studying climate adaptation. We have great data. We've been, supported by great scientists and great engineers. There's plenty of information available. Our work tries to visualize that and to synthesize it in a way. And while we're not prepared to make final recommendations, we'll publish this report in September at the end of our project. I want to share with you just briefly the way that we're approaching this work. We're organizing these thoughts into 7 broad themes in an intuitive way, with the place that makes the most sense to us, which is to begin to armor, protect your coastlines, your communities, protect your inner harbors. We're advocating that you would approach this through a combination of both gray infrastructure, that is kind of heavy, kind of traditional, robust built structures, but also so-called green infrastructure, that is rebuilding resilience capacity through maintaining dunes and wetlands and rebuilding marshland and the like. Much of this work has built upon the work of Horsley Witten and others across the community. So our goal is to synthesize and to visualize those options. And again, without making any recommendations, we could tell you that, of course, among the forms of vulnerability would be the inner harbor, particularly around Gloucester. And of course, there have been proposals like this, looking at a harbor hurricane barrier. This is the more ambitious version of those 2 things, the so-called outer harbor plan, with some back of house work behind Gloucester. There is a more modest version of this, which is just looking at the inner harbor of Gloucester. And you can imagine different scales and intensity of construction, different scales of funding required, and the like. We have seen similar studies for Manchester by the Sea and a storm surge barrier there. Looking at the exposure on Rockport, there's an equivalent there. Of course, it's a very different exposure to the north and east, much different geography and geology. But a part of our work has been to try to understand, well, how might this work change the look and feel of Cape Ann? People, have migrated to Cape Ann over the centuries, in part because of the proximity of living in nature and living on the waterfront. And as we've done in this set of studies, we're looking at how these armoring defensive strategies, these gray and green infrastructures, how they might, both maintain the look and feel of Cape Ann, but also how they might be integrated into a more sustainable way of living on Cape Ann going forward. A part of this work looks at your critical supply systems, as Krista mentioned. These are the electrical grid, they are the wastewater treatment and water supply systems. And of course, what we're doing is we're gathering a range of literature and a range of precedents from around the US and around the world, looking at various options to buffer, defend, elevate vertically, to build redundant systems, or ultimately even to fall back and to relocate some of those assets. We're doing studies such as this. This is a site at the Essex County Club in which we're imagining the goal of absorbing and holding water on site across the Cape as a generalized strategy. This is one instance, but living with water, both in flood conditions and after storm events, is something that we obviously are going to be focusing on. Maintaining the rail connection, the MBTA line, with a combination of storm surge gates and elevated and more robust bascule bridge replacement, that's also on our thinking. Thinking about transportation networks more broadly, of course, most of the transportation on Cape Ann is automobile and truck-based, it's road-based, and those present very particular vulnerabilities. And here again, we have a range of literatures, a range of precedents that we'll be publishing at the end of our project this year, where we look to either realign, elevate vertically, build into bridges or causeways, build barrier systems, or ultimately to stop maintaining and to allow to fall into disrepair. You can see here in this section at Essex Causeway, Woodman's Landing, you can see one version of that, which would be basically to kind of continue to maintain the causeway to allow for more natural systems to work underneath. In a more, let's say, kind of normative, more everyday kind of situation, thinking about bioswales and absorbing and holding water underground. Of course, many of the studies that we've done and many of the precedents that we look at focus on the idea of simply elevating the site of the public realm. This is something that many cities are doing just now. Of course, it's also something that many cities have done historically. Cities like Chicago and Seattle took the decision in the 19th century to simply elevate their entire central business district by one floor. We're not proposing that here, but we have done these kinds of studies looking at the most vulnerable communities, the most vulnerable districts, the most vulnerable regions across Cape Ann, and what that might look like with respect to a range of strategies to elevate and simply maintain central businesses, in this case, Rockport's Inner Harbor, motif number 1, and the like. You can see here an equivalent study of Manchester by the Sea and their village core. The idea of, on the one hand, maintaining the MBTA and elevating it, building a kind of surge gate system to protect the inner harbor, but also allowing more natural resilience through the rebuilding of wetlands, that kind of work. Of course, Essex faces even graver challenges given the fact that it's built largely over historic wetlands, and that's one of our primary focus areas, is that areas that have been built on fill, areas that are presently in the FEMA floodplain, areas that have historically built in marshes, they tend to go back to being wet more often than other places. And we have a range of precedent projects and literature that will help us understand and help folks on Cape Ann understand what might this place look like and how might we maintain its identity as we allow it to maintain its resilience going forward. We are also interested in accelerating natural adaptation. The natural systems on Cape Ann are already changing. This has to do, in this case, with 2 studies. We're looking at, obviously, the beach ecosystems and the wetland or marsh ecosystems. In this case, of course, not all of those beaches that you prize will be sustainable over time. Many of them are eroding at a very, very fast pace. Others are places where infrastructure might be abandoned or dismantled and allowed to return into something more like a natural wetland system. One of the topics that we're interested in here, and we'll learn more about from you today, is the notion of relocation. That's not something we put on the top of mind, but certainly individuals, individual actors, individual institutions are already making choices about climate change and its effects. Of course, we have good data that suggests that every residential landowner on the coast is already enduring a kind of tax through the lack of appreciation associated with risks in climate change. We know that reinsurance markets and mortgage markets are already building risk into their real estate pro formas. In this context, we don't believe that this is a culture or a venue in which relocation will be managed, but rather, in fact, both the literature and the precedents we're looking at suggest individual agency. So our goal here would be to get information to individuals and institutions to allow them to understand the risk that they're exposed to. This, for example, is a map of the over almost 1,400 residential structures sitting presently in the FEMA floodplain. That's today in present dollars and numbers. Of course, that's only going to get worse as sea levels rise and storm events increase. Ultimately, in these contexts, we will have a range of options looking at relocating density and providing effectively more housing, because of course, housing is already quite limited on Cape Ann and quite expensive. And then finally, while we haven't spent a lot of time on this, we will be looking in the future and future parts of this project to focus on post-carbon economies. To decarbonize the economy, of course, is central going forward. Even if Cape Ann decarbonizes its economy tomorrow, ultimately, even if Cape Ann decarbonized its economy tomorrow, that would have a negligible effect on greenhouse gases globally. So what's in the mail in terms of storm event and sea level rise, we will have to live with. And our goal really is to help our friends on Cape Ann think about how they might continue to live in that context. Of course, there are a range of policies and practices that are available out there in thinking about cultural and maritime heritage districts, so-called SALTs, which are land trusts in respect to sea level rise and the like. So again, thanks for the invitation to be here. Happy to chat with you this morning, spend some more time in our breakout session, and we'll look forward to sharing our findings with you at the end of the summer.
Thank you so much. That was really great. We appreciate that. I would also like to now introduce the Voices for Climate Action. So Ayaka Yamashita and Sohun Kang. If I apologize if I have mispronounced your names, and please correct me when you introduce yourselves. And if you have a presentation, please feel free to share your screens.
Sure. Thank you. Wait for a moment, and I'm sharing. Okay. Oh wait. Um, oh, do you see my screen?
I do. I see,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. So the software, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Once again, like, thank you for the invitations. Hello, I'm Ayaka.
My name is Serwin.
Yes, the research associate from the Harvard Graduate School of Design, a critical landscape design lab. So today we will present the excerpt of our report, Cape and Fieldwork, receptions of climate change in coastal populations. So we stayed in Gloucester for 3 months, independent 3 months, and then conducted a field work independently, actually, from the Voices project. So our main question was, what are the perceptions of Cape Town residents on the present and the future considering climate change? So we laid out our findings in findings of our 3 months field work in 4 chapters, in addition to a cultural conversation with over 100 people throughout the research. We conducted appointment-based semi-structured interview with 44 Cape Town residents from our various groups. By walking, biking, using public transportations, and then riding
Don't forget to move the slides.
Pardon?
Don't forget to move the slides.
Huh?
The slide is not moving.
Oh, what is going? Your screen share is posted. Okay. Maybe I will try again. Stop share. Like, sorry about that.
No, that's totally fine.
Wait for a moment. Sorry, I will just try once again. Sorry.
No reason to
Or maybe
apologize.
again, I should just do it in like this way, probably. It's okay. So let's go back to this one, and then I will try once again the full screen mode.
Oh, yeah, maybe don't try to full screen it because we
Okay.
can do it. Yeah.
Okay, then probably I will
Pause your-
not do it.
Yeah.
I will just continue with this one. Sorry for that
That's okay,
interruptions.
that's okay. And
Okay.
you're doing good. Thank
Okay,
you.
so I will just continue. So
Yes.
by walking, biking, using public transportations, and then riding in residence car, we explored the Cape Town landscapes and observed the local lives. We also participated and engaged in various community activities. And then also we did a cognitive map workshop to ask residents to draw and represent mentally one's physical environment. How that was also our the research highlight. So from the chapter 1, description of Cape Town, we first share the Cape Town geography. As we went through a number of interviews, we noticed that people define Cape Town differently depending on the context, a region or an island or a group of 4 towns. For the landscape of Cape Town, we focused on 4 landscape: beaches, marshlands, quarries, and forest. For example, the beaches and the waterfront are the most mentioned landscape in the interviews as a reason for liking Cape Town as much as the battlefield of various forces: tourism, fishing industry, real estate development, privatizations, and conservation. Cape Town has been influenced by the influx of people with different cultural backgrounds. We encountered people who have roots in Sicilian islands like Italy and Azores Island, Portugal. Also, there are people from various parts of the world, as you see in this map. Our work then highlights in chapter 2 that the residents' various voices on climate change through 6 fictional characters' tales. And we actually summarized it in the story in Q&A format. And then, so for today, we just show in this kind of format, but like we have a stories of 6 characters.
And we categorize 6 different attitudes towards climate change based on the fieldwork. They are convinced, uncertain, anxious, indifferent, unperturbed, and unwilling. Convinced is a state of accepting information regardless of one's preference. We found many interviewees being convinced about climate change. When asked about climate change, they relied on subjective experiences and scientific explanations. Feeling uncertain refers to a lack of conviction. Many of our interviewees answered with uncertainty regarding climate change. This uncertainty derives from two reasons. One, lacking of subjective experience of climate change, and the other is feeling insufficient to make an argument on climate. Anxiety is a state of mind which fears losing certainty. It comes from losing what has been certain for them, such as beautiful landscapes, especially beaches. An underlying desire of the anxious is to keep the status quo. The climate change indifferent have either no interest or no sympathy in the subject. Because they cannot feel it nor see its impact, they are not interested in. Unperturbed is a state of calm based on confidence in relation to concerns or problems. Climate change for the unperturbed is another problem to be prepared and overcome. Past experiences of recovering from weather events, such as storms, give the unperturbed confidence regardless of the actual capacity to withstand climate change. The unwilling refers to a state of rejecting or accepting reluctantly. The unwilling believe climate change is not happening or happening but slow and unnoticeable, or even a scam. A common characteristic of the unwilling is to doubt the media, experts, science, technologies. The unwilling have a sense of being under attack by larger forces, such as the government. Unwilling to accept the climate change agenda does not mean not caring for nature. In fact, it is almost the opposite. As much as they are feeling under attack, they want to protect their surroundings, including nature. An interviewee who called global warming a scam described the preferred future is to be cosmic beings with values of conservation, stewardship, cooperation, nurturing, and local government, local people working together. And she went on. We think finding a common ground with the unwilling based on specific agenda is an important step for inclusive climate change decision-making process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you bringing your work to us this morning. And before I would like to introduce Gail Seavey, who is also doing some local interviewing on Cape Ann. And Gail, I didn't know if you had a presentation or if you just wanted to speak to some of your.
I wanted to say a few words. I was
Great.
a couple minutes. I'm just
Sure.
an example of many people who are interviewing people. I apologize. I don't seem to have my video working today. But so I was one of many people who interviewed. I only interviewed 7 people in Gloucester. Their ages were from late 20s to late 80s. The people I interviewed all happened to grow up off of Cape Ann, some very near and some very far away, but they had lived here from 4 years to 36 years. And they had a lot of different opinions as they looked through it, from, oh, we should pick up litter, to, oh, why do we still have gas stations? We shouldn't be using gas anymore. But they all believed in this hurricane. Many of them had seen their own homes washed. One person had seen their own home washed away 3 times and had moved to higher ground. The most common response was wanting to be part of a process of people being educated about this to prepare for this hurricane. I think things like how do we exit? How do we leave? What's safe routes to go was much more talked about. Roads were talked about more than anything, than any other large. People were very skeptical about the large engineering projects. They thought maybe more naturalized was more work. They were very skeptical that anybody would leave their land ever. And they were very skeptical that even raising buildings would help, because they've all seen it get higher, even the people who've only been here a little bit. They've all seen big waves wash away things. So there was a lot of skepticism. They just wanted to know an escape route, or how to have a lot of water in case they're stuck in their house for weeks. Quite honestly, that was the most common feedback. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I appreciate your reporting out for us. So now we are going to sort of take those very brief, obviously, presentations, and start thinking about where we can take action. Where should, where do we want to, so now we want to talk about ideas, actions, and projects that can address the vulnerable and help build resilience. I keep saying we, but I'm really referring to you all who are living on Cape Ann. And to do that, we have picked 4 sort of bins about where sort of ideas and projects can fall under, sort of taking a bit of inspiration from our speakers this morning. So we have our gray or hard infrastructure like roads and bridges, seawalls, and then our more green infrastructure, thinking about natural systems and how their ability to help reduce impacts. Are they enhanced, maintained, thinking about living shorelines, using natural features to manage stormwater and flooding, habitat restoration, those types of things. I'm thinking about policies and regulations, elevation that Gail sort of touched on, managed relocation policy. So any sort of regulatory or policy decisions that could be thought about. And then finally, public awareness and education. We heard a lot about that as well this morning. So what sort of ideas and actions could we be thinking about around there? So in your small groups, a facilitator will help guide the conversation. So our questions are to you are, what are your ideas to address these vulnerable areas and people? Where are there opportunities to move forward? What are the challenges with these ideas and projects? And where are there opportunities for collaboration and partnership among the Cape Ann communities? So those are sort of trying to we have ideas, but sort of thinking them through a little bit more. And so after you've had some time to make a list of projects and have discussions about them, we want you to all work together and pick your top 2 or 3 to report out to the larger group. And, the others that don't sort of make it to the report out, we are documenting them and they will not be forgotten, but we're trying to look to help prioritize, figure out what is most important to you and what are most critical. And then finally, we also want to help Cape Ann keep this conversation going. So what information would you need to help understand these issues or help make decisions? Who else should we be talking to? Also thinking about capacity, that could be part of the challenges and opportunity discussion as well. So with that, as I said, you'll each have a facilitator who will help guide you through the discussion. So we're going to take 40 minutes. So we'll come back together at 10:20. So we're going to give you time to talk, and then we'll have another larger conversation all together so we can hear the ideas that came out of that group and sort of start thinking about what's a priority and sort of next steps related to those. And my colleague Natasha will do the magic and put you all in your groups. And you can accept and join your room. Thank you. See you soon. So folks wanted to join, there you go, join your room and you can get started on your conversations.
I want to be in the policy and regulations room, not room 2.
Everybody's going to talk about everything.
Oh, I thought these were separate rooms for separate topics.
Nope. So your ideas, we're going to put them in different bins. So it's going to be all the ideas are going to be talked about together.
Everyone should have been assigned a breakout room. So if you're having issues getting to it, please unmute yourself or place in chat and I can help you get on over there.
Is anyone having trouble trying to get into their assigned group? No. We can help troubleshoot that.
Both clicked at the exact same time.
Thank you. Yes. So we'll just give everyone a chance to come back in the room and we'll get started again. Welcome back, everyone. If you had a good conversation and just looking at some chat. So yes, hello, welcome back. The recording has been restarted, just so you all are aware. And what we're going to do is we're going to go around to each of the facilitators and ask them to report out the projects that you guys had prioritized, and just kind of get some idea of where those ideas would land on Cape Ann, some challenges, some opportunities, talking about who benefits, and then where there are opportunities for collaboration. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to record notes live in front of you all. And I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to ask my colleagues, Natasha and whomever, to help me keep an eye on the chat and folks who raise their hand and all of that. So first, I'm going to start with Ellie's group. And if you wanted to tell us your first project that came to the top of the list.
Sure. So we had a very exciting conversation. I thought it was really positive and a little bit, I would say a little bit different than I kind of anticipated in terms of the topic. So our project falls under the regulation and policies bin. And we talked a lot about the need for innovative zoning and other land use policies to both sort of redirect development that is happening now to have less impact and sort of cause less harm and not exacerbate the climate impacts that we're seeing. And then also using zoning to think about how to address climate change or remove people from harm in the future. So, I think it's sort of obvious on Cape Ann that the major issue is sea level rise, storm surge impacts, and keeping people out of harm's way. So there was a lot of talk about either changing zoning, introducing new zoning. We learned from Essex that Essex is doing a zoning study right now that is not not focused on climate change, but will be incorporating climate change as one of the elements that it considers. So really kind of working with each of the communities on, policy and zoning to get people out of harm's way. And one of the ideas that came out of that, which is related, but maybe we put it, I don't know, it could go in this bin, it could also go in public education, but we talked about, possibly having a, bringing planning staff and planning boards together across the different communities to work together in this discussion, because there's a lot that people can learn from each other. And it also sort of strengthens, the ability for one community to make some changes if the whole region is thinking about these changes and incorporating these ideas. And then there's also the element of education that goes with that. So sharing ideas across Cape Ann can help with public education. It helps foster the discussion and bring this whole discussion to another level. So hopefully I captured that well. We also learned as part of that Gloucester is hiring a sustainability director. So that might, help with this discussion, but it also raises another sort of separate topic that I would identify, or separate idea, which is this issue of siloed agencies and siloed sort of projects are being undertaken in communities, and they're sort of being done. There might be a housing project over here or a project addressing education over here, but they're not necessarily taking into account climate change and climate impacts that we're talking about. And there was really sort of this realization in our discussion that climate change, it affects, has effects across all silos. And so this idea of Gloucester hiring the sustainability director is a way of breaking down those silos and bringing the climate discussion to all of these different decisions and projects that might be going on in a community. So I don't know whether, Krista, that goes into regulation and policy or public education, but this idea of hiring staff to break down these silos or facilitate this discussion across silos.
I think I'm inclined to put it as another
policy.
I know it's sort of not real. It kind of is. I see your point. It sort of overlaps, and it can have, like, as planners, you have multiple roles in a community. So,
right.
Or even, and that can be, as a sustainability director, again, that could be a role of addressing multiple facets. So you're talking.
So for now, I would put like municipal sustainability resilience staff.
Great.
And so, the collaboration opportunities with both of these, we really discussed the idea of bringing the communities across Cape Ann together to broaden this discussion, because it's easier to do it together than it is for one community to step out. And you have the idea of learning from each other, not recreating the wheel. And one other topic that was brought up around that is just that Cape Ann is not a ton of people. And so there's a lot of shoreline to address and a lot of potential impacts to address, and not a giant population and not a giant funding source. So it helps to work together.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to call on Gabby next. And, you know, Gabby, if you have a similar, one of your similar priorities are related to what Ellie pointed out, you know, we can highlight those and maybe give you an opportunity to add something to others that are kind of different. So I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Krista. Yeah, we had a great conversation in our group, a ton of project ideas, and I think basically every single one was focused on regional collaboration, which was great. We did, similar to Ellie, have a priority for looking at zoning and policy reform for Cape Ann communities, and we did a couple of examples. We talked about net zero energy, building stretch codes, things like that. So maybe slightly different than what Ellie's group talked about. But yeah, again, basically highlighting that need to look at policy and zoning reform to see if there's changes that could be implemented to make these communities more resilient. So I'll talk about two other ones that have not come up yet. One of them is more focused on green infrastructure. And that one is investing in the protection of barrier beaches. So we talked in particular about Cranes Beach, Coffin and Wingersheek, because without those barrier beaches, obviously we'll lose some protections for critical areas in Cape Ann. So, you know, Essex, Gloucester, Ipswich, even Rockport and Gloucester have beaches as well that outside of, you know, Crane and Coffin that are of a concern as well. Tied in with that, we talked about also doing a comprehensive inventory of natural resources in Cape Ann. So assessing health of our natural resources and how we can improve those to help mitigate what's coming. And we really felt like this is something that needs to happen at a regional level. It's a great way for communities to share resources. It's a nice way to elevate resources that might otherwise get overlooked.
Can I just pause you there for a minute, Gabby? Can you just
sorry.
that for me? Sure. So inventory of natural resources to see.
To assess their current health.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also how they can be enhanced.
Great, thank you. Sort of updating my note taking skills. So great. And sort of, were there any specifics or any collaboration?
Yeah, so we said that this needs to happen at the Cape Ann scale. So maybe that's going to be sharing, you know, a staff or consultant who's helping to do that inventory for all of Cape Ann. But we felt like that is a great way to elevate resources that might otherwise get overlooked. It's like one group member talks about how, you know, eelgrass and cordgrass, sometimes it's hard to talk about them at a smaller scale about how important they are. But when you look at all of Cape Ann, it really kind of elevates how critical that resource is for climate change. So that was one of our ideas. And then I get one more, right, Krista?
Yeah, you get more.
Okay, so I make sure we had a lot of ideas.
I know, and they all, and just to remind folks, we are going to capture all of them, but we're just kind of putting some out here for discussion. Great,
Okay.
go ahead, Gabby.
The next one we want to highlight was education and outreach. And we talked about having in place education and outreach tools that ideally are available to all Cape Ann communities. And ideally having a place where conversations like this can take place, where you have multiple communities coming into one space. And we would like that to be in place now because the point was made that some folks aren't really going to get on board until we have multiple extreme storms happening back to back. So we want to invest in those resources now so that people can kind of channel those emotions of fear and concern into collective action.
Great. Was there any discussion about how that, were there any, you know, it clearly it has a collaboration sense to it, like it's basically its crux. Are there any challenges or opportunities that you all identified related to either of those?
I think we talked about, trying to make sure that we keep the language positive so that people feel like they're engaged in something that's moving forward. And also like recognizing the opportunity to talk about both short-term and long-term financial benefits too, to try and make sure we're pulling in folks to the table who might have different priorities. But yeah, we felt like this really needs to happen at a regional scale because that's a way for communities to share resources with one another and again, facilitate conversations that are going to occur with multiple communities in one room. So similar to like we're doing today.
Right, great, thank you. Let's see. I'm gonna pick on Kelly this time.
Sure, Krista. So our first idea that I wanted to get into was around evacuation and emergency planning. So we talked about opportunities to have kind of like a municipal official tabletop exercise to plan for, in an emergency situation, what happens, when does this response happen? And then taking that a step further, is there an opportunity to have kind of a resident focused voluntary evacuation drill? So residents can kind of learn, where do you need to go? What do you need to take? How long is it going to take you to evacuate? And that could include public awareness around, where are your emergency shelters in place? And what are those emergency response channels that will assist you if you're sheltering in place on Cape Ann during a natural hazard? I will pause for a second.
My fast typing skills challenged. So great. So opportunity. So for a municipal emergency responders and that whole emergency management team. So having a tabletop exercise around evacuation and just during a situation that happens for them, but also for residents and businesses.
Correct. And then in terms of the evacuation exercise for residents, that's something that could also be paired with general public awareness about what are your resources on Cape Ann if you need to shelter on Cape Ann. So where's the emergency evacuation shelter that you can spend the night at? And so for both of those, obviously that's scalable. That could be focused on just one community, but it could also just as easily be done at a regional Cape Ann level. Okay, and then we also spent a substantial amount of time talking about kind of public education awareness and engagement and the language around that. So we did, to Gabby's comment about having those open channels and conversations at a regional and community level to talk about climate change and vulnerabilities and hazards. We did touch on that, but we also wanted to make a note of, it's important with public education to recognize that that can sometimes be a top-down approach, which is not what we want to do. We don't want to be in a situation where we're imposing the idea that we know what's best for folks and we know what they need. So to figure out engagement efforts that can be really bottoms up and start with residents in the community and have those conversations be a little bit more inclusive and open-minded. So that was kind of more just a general comment on how that effort goes.
I just added that to Gabby's comment. Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, Craig.
Yes, so I think I'm just going to do it based on themes we didn't really get a chance to prioritize, but
that's totally fine. Understood.
So folks, one of the main themes was impacts to groundwater from sea level rise, raising roads, elevating bridges. Overarching statement is that everybody's is drawing on the same supply. So it should, there should be opportunities for collaboration there and a sort of unified approach. Some folks mentioned specifically Gloucester, Route 128 Grant Circle down to Washington Street, Route 133 Manchester by the Sea. But that was also mentioned as similar to what Kelly just mentioned regarding evacuation. Some of the communities have one way in, one way out, and evacuation needs to be a little bit more coordinated. But then also applicable to utility providers provision. There's one main electrical trunk that comes in along Chubbs Creek, which is the main source for Cape Ann. But bringing utility providers into the conversation as well as a unified approach. Specifically, folks talked about Mill River, Babson Reservoir in Gloucester. There's affordable housing located there. It's a very high concern based on some of the interviews that folks completed as part of this project.
So what, I'm just trying to find places for all these projects, Craig, so.
So I think, this was really gray hard infrastructure, just water supply.
Okay. Yep.
Sorry.
That's okay.
And then also looking at, again, Sawmill Brook, Manchester by the Sea, folks mentioned utility redundancy again, Route 127. And then also factoring in utilities that are being conveyed across any bridges with no alternatives for rerouting.
Okay.
And then the other piece the other theme that we had was maybe green infrastructure and policy and regulations. It addressed wetlands and the need for wetlands to be able to move and migrate. Folks mentioned Good Harbor Beach, I believe in Gloucester, top of the harbor. Utilizing tree planting as part of the green infrastructure or restoration application. Folks also commented about marshes. Some locations, Raymond and Ocean Streets in Manchester have already, there are several repetitive lost properties there. Canomo Point in Essex and Sarasota Marsh, Long Beach and Rockport. Also, the seawall is impacting flooding from both sides. I know I'm kind of all over the place, but we were.
I know, I'm just trying, if you could sort of pinpoint something that we could, maybe add to our list. I know you have a lot of stuff. I know that, so we have wetlands and the ability to migrate, and was there a project related to that, or just, or what was, I'm just trying to, I can add a couple.
I guess specifically some folks mentioned Bass Avenue behind the Stop and Shop complex, where there's the tidal flow was backed up. The pipe was blocked in order to construct residential housing. I'm just trying to look at my notes.
Fine.
And then just folks mentioned the marshes in Manchester. It was originally a single complex, and that's the Raymond Ocean Streets. And then again, Canomo Point in Essex.
I'm gonna get some spelling.
Yes.
All right. We have some stuff in the chat. So really just addressing some resource mention. I think this could be related to this idea above about just doing some natural resource assessment on the health of them, and that definitely could be incorporated into that perhaps.
Yes.
You had some very specific places, so that's helpful. And I apologize for not spelling Canomo Point correctly.
Nope, that's right.
Oh, it is? Great. So these are some very, good spectrum of ideas. And what I'd like to do with the larger group is sort of get a sense of, you can raise your hand or write in the chat, which of these do you think are sort of a priority right now on Cape Ann? So we have a lot of good ideas and we want to be able to focus and sort of get a starting point of what you think might be the priority. And again, we do recognize that this is a small group compared to the larger region, but is there a priority that's on this list? And you can type in the chat, you can raise your hand. We have the great infrastructure pieces, our water supply needs, incorporating utility redundance, utilities that cross bridges that have no alternative for rerouting. Those aren't particularly specific projects, but a starting point for developing something. And under green infrastructure, investing in barrier beach restoration, doing an inventory of natural resources to understand their health, including wetlands and their ability to do their function. We had several under zoning, looking at zoning to be more innovative and considering climate change going forward, not exacerbating it, using it to help address people and moving them out of harm's way. We put staffing under here, but also thinking about other ideas around net zero energy and stretch codes. So we have two votes for zoning. And I'm thinking, what are your top two? I'm gonna, give you the honesty. We're not gonna sort of count, but just really looking for what you think are priority. And then under education, just developing outreach tools that all the Cape Ann communities can utilize. Creating a place where we can continue these conversations. Multiple communities can come into a space where they can sort of understand the issues. And related to that, I think maybe this, language around public engagement, that's sort of a larger global, I almost think like this might be a separate one. Maybe
Hey, Krista, this is Ellie. We have a hand up, so I want to give him an option.
Thank you.
Jerry, go right ahead.
I'm not Jerry, as I told you. I'm Ed, but that's all right. I think there are two issues that hit me. One is in the regulation. We need to go beyond sustainability. We need to look at zoning as the whole issue of zoning and intertown cooperation. I was on the planning board in Rockport. We have no director anymore. We can't afford one. I think we need a Cape Ann group that shares resources so we have expertise that each one of the communities can draw on relative to their population or some way of doing it, to get expertise in a number of areas, which could be, individual communities can't necessarily afford to have that expertise. And I'm talking about it, that is a general thing, not just a reaction to this problem, but it's something I've felt for a long time, but this really brings it up. And number two, with respect to education, what if we have somebody who could be a good editor and we work with GDT to get a climate change column in there on a daily, not a daily basis, but a weekly basis, where we can begin to bring up subjects and that can result in letters to the editor or people cooperating. Thank you.
A regular feature. And
yeah, a regular feature, right.
Yep. That's great. We have a lot of comments in the chat. Regional zoning, regulations and zoning for climate resilience and hazard mitigation. Lots of folks are rallying around the zoning. Regional discussions around siloed governance systems. I think that had come up down here. when we were talking about zoning, so maybe we add that up here. Discussion of climate. Apartments, systems, so addressing the silo scenario, for lack of a better term. Zoning is important.
Krista, Robert Myers has his hand up.
Thank you, Robert. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Are there, in addition to zoning and some of the other ideas that were there, are there things that we can do to mitigate the sea level rise? For instance, if we're contributing significantly to the warming of the Gulf of Maine with our fossil fuel acid rain precipitations from our oil burners on shore, and we switch over to all electrification, is that something that could make a sort of postpone it or mitigate it to some extent? Things of that nature.
Right. Yeah. So I'm sorry, reducing, you say carbon, I'm sorry. I was trying to
Sure.
put a spot for it. But yeah, it's sort of another idea. I think there's some further discussion. Here we have our net energy and zero stretch code. So it's mostly kind of related to energy usage, energy efficiency, and buildings and structures and development. But it seems like you're talking sort of a larger picture.
Right. So there are going to be impacts acknowledged, I think, generally that are increased by the accelerated rate of warming of the Gulf of Maine. And to the extent that we are having an impact on that from those that are to the west of the ocean, to the west of Gulf of Maine, are the things that we can do to actually mitigate or reduce or delay the impact of the Great Storm of 2038. And one of the thought also is, could we perhaps put solar panels on our reservoir, not only to produce power, but also to reduce evaporation of our water supply, given that there's going to be incursions of seawater and some impacts on our drinking water and groundwater supplies. Things of that nature, mitigation things that we can do.
Sure. I think that's a great idea to sort of start thinking about those specifics. Are there regional sort of ways that can be done, or collaboration between maybe one or more communities? Is that sort of how ways to kind of implement it from that perspective as well?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that if we are having, for instance, if all of the warming of Gulf of Maine, which is an accelerant for the sea rise, acknowledged by even our expert here, Waldheim, on the call, if there are things like that, is it all because of something like the Gulf Stream that's deviated in warming up, or are we, in terms of our fossil fuel consumption on shore, actually contributing significantly to that warm acceleration, such that if we take advantage of the offshore winds and the electrification that comes with it, we could actually reduce that to some degree? Or do we really not have any significant impact in that way? I don't know.
So that's sort of more information that's needed, more discussion that could happen around that, and thinking
Sure.
how there could be some collaboration to sort of meet that challenge as well. And
right.
I'm just keeping an eye on time. I know, Professor Waldheim, I see your hand up as well, and I welcome your contribution. So please.
Thanks, Krista. Thanks, Robert. Just in response to Robert's notes in the chat and here, we certainly will be recommending and will advocate for decarbonizing your economy. That's a first principle good thing to do. But the scale at which that operates is something we'll advocate for, but it will not have an appreciable or demonstrable impact on the kinds of climatological change that Cape Ann will likely experience. That is, it's neither big enough nor localized enough. It is true that this part of the world is both rising and warming faster than other parts of the world. And we would advocate for moving toward an electric economy away from the fossil fuel economy, but I think it's unlikely to have much impact on this material going forward.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that perspective. And let's see. So there are lots of ideas in the chat and we will take those. I did want to I saw something that caught my eye is from Katie and just talking about a collective vision forward. And that's sort of an idea to sort of take stock into that. We are been very focused, and that is our goal here today, is to look for specific projects to address, current and emerging needs, but also, thinking about that collective vision that she suggests, and how that can help inform, continuing the conversation and identifying information needs. So related to that, I just thought I wanted to highlight some of that. Lots of great comments. So folks, hopefully you can check out the chat. Any other information needs that people might think you would like to have to help make better decisions, to help bring to local decision makers, perhaps, that you'd like to share? Yes, lots of ideas. Great.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Mary, go right ahead.
Almost everything we're talking about is going to require money.
Yes.
And I wonder if anybody knows where Cape Ann fits in the pecking order as all these coastal communities start needing funds.
Well, I will respond to that, because that's you're kind of giving us a nice segue into our final comments. And part of our role is to help identify some funding opportunities for projects that have come out of today's meeting. And, I can't speak to how Cape Ann or the communities will be ranked, but I think our goal is to find a diverse set of financial tools and assistance that can help move these ideas forward. So yes, we have this lovely wish list, but our intent is to also help kind of keep moving the needle forward and giving you all the resources that you need to help sort of start to implement and have further discussions around them.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for that question.
Krista, this is Ellie again. I see Valerie's up, and I know from our breakout group that Valerie has some thoughts on the financing as well.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. Please take the floor.
Thanks. Just to follow up on that comment, we did mention that we're very long coastlines and very few people. And it's important to start looking at over the long term, whether federal and state insurance, local funding is going to be enough to meet the costs of many of these projects. Where are we in the pecking order for state and federal governments over the long term? I think that's a really, really good question. The other thing that I've noted is how many groups brought up opportunities for communities and municipalities and people at the regional level to work together. And I think trying to assemble a list of all the different ideas of how Cape Ann could work together would be a really interesting, important summary for us to take a look at. That was pretty striking.
I muted myself. Yes, I think, and that is our intent, is to take all of these ideas that we just talked about largely as a group, but also there was so many more that you all had from your small group discussion. So our next steps are to organize that for our Cape Ann team, for them to sort of help them move forward. Again, identify some different funding opportunities that are available to help sort of, again, move the needle. And I don't know if anyone else had some final comments or questions. I would be happy to take them, and sort of any final thoughts and ideas. Great. I love the comments in the chat, are fantastic. Thank you so much, everyone.
Krista, this is Ellie. I just wanted to offer, here, I'll turn my video. Just wanted to one, I guess, closing thought with regard to the pecking order. I don't think anybody knows necessarily the pecking order or when funding will be available to Cape Ann versus other parts of Massachusetts versus other parts of the country. But I think one thing that is really positive that's happening here right now is the discussion and sort of the forethought to try to come up with makes sense and get ahead if we can, to the extent that we can, to get ahead of some of these issues. And I think being prepared with projects and ideas and policy changes, et cetera, kind of puts you in front of the line for opportunities of funding when they do come out. So being prepared when funding is available, and it is becoming available. So I think what's happening here is really, really positive, and the idea of working together across Cape Ann can really bolster the opportunity. People, I think, like to see funding agencies, like to see communities working together. They like new ideas. It's a little hard sometimes with new ideas, but I think you're better off, trying to get ahead of some of these ideas and in front of the funding as you are doing than, coming up in the rear. So I think this is really positive, and hopefully this starts or continues the conversation on Cape Ann.
And thank you, Ellie. And I would just add that a lot of you are residents and business owners, and I think that helps to garner support for those who different agencies that will be local agencies or groups that are applying it. They can demonstrate public support also gives some leaning on your effort to just having that support locally, that there's been public engagement and that there's a lot of support on the ground for this. So thank you. I don't know if anyone has any other final thoughts, or I just thank you all for spending your morning with us. On a Monday morning is always a challenge, and I do appreciate that you were able to join us.
Thanks, Krista.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Great meeting again.
Thank you.